G'day YouTube, Warbles on a lot here with part 2 of the Mindfield on money, the Banking Royal Commission, Aristotle and the nature of wealth,
Please do, because
social responsibility.
That are on the end of the radio show. If you're interested, you can do that wherever it is you subscribe to such things.
I'm quite an educated person, and I feel that when you go for advice, it's a bit like you go to a doctor and he's been trained to deal with your problem. You go to a lawyer and the same thing. So I felt that Carl and Chris, being professional financial advisors and business bankers through the Westpac Bank, that we had been to a big bank that we had banked in for 16 years, and I never thought that I would be lied to. I thought what I was being told was the truth.
That was Jacqueline McDowell, who's a former Westpac customer, giving evidence a couple of weeks back to the Royal Commission into misconduct into banking superannuation in the financial services industry. And for me, that was actually one of the most poignant moments. And she raised something there that I really want to put to our guest. Gordon Menzies is Associate Professor of Economics at the University of Technology in Sydney. And he was an economist with the Reserve Bank of Australia for more than a decade. But one of the real reasons we wanted to have him on the show is because of the research that he's done most recently on how to restore trust in finance, research that he did at the Institute for New Economic Thinking at the Oxford Martin School. Hi, Gordon. Good morning. So I might not invite you to wade into the vagaries of Aristotelian abolish capital growth. but take this as a kind of premise. If we take anything like the Aristotelian tradition seriously, then money is at least a potentially hazardous product. It's something that can throw away its utility and can become an object of fixation in and of itself. If we see money as something that is potentially hazardous to the moral life, I mean, the question that Jacqueline McDowell there raised is a very important one. Why should we not require the same moral formation, the same vocational identity that we would expect, for instance, from a doctor or a lawyer or a representative politician? Is this the kind of thing, the seriousness about the material and the tradition in which those who work with money are operating, could this be the real first step towards moralizing banking?
Well, that's a great question, Scott. I guess I do see a useful example in medicine and law for finance to follow. People who want to defend our economic system would say that when financially motivated firms maximise profits, they have to look after their customers or they'll be ruined. Their customers will leave them. But unfortunately, there are some services that are very complicated where it's easy to mislead clients, so they don't know if they've been looked after until it's too late. And I agree with you, that was a very important bit of filming, a very, very important moment when the woman was testifying. The service is so complicated that's being provided, they are forced to trust the provider. And in addition to this, there are some services where the things provided have such important, critical, practical value where they can't be replaced easily if they're lost. So she mentioned medicine and law. Medicine looks after your health, law looks after your freedom. If you lose those things, they're very difficult to recover. So for these kinds of services, when clients can easily be misled over extremely important matters, then I think society shouldn't rely entirely on financial motivation, and there should be instead a professional culture of trustworthiness, truth-telling, care, what's called fiduciary duty. Now, is finance in this category? Well, I think it obviously is. It's easy to mislead people, and also what's provided for many people at least is a retirement income and their housing. And so I think there is a case for professionalisation along the lines of medicine and law, as she hinted.
You could put media in that category potentially as well. Once you start playing this game, the range of professions potentially grows. I like the point that you make about complexity. I think that's what I was getting at, where I was asking Scott what concept of money he was using, because I think that's where the concept of money is really profound here. It's the fact that this operates at such a level of abstraction that you can get, leveraging and all sorts of jargonistic terms no one really understands, perhaps even the people who use them.
Let me say something about that, if I may. I don't myself put much significance in the form of money, the fact that it's not tied to gold anymore. My view on that is that you have to remember that since we have what's called fiat money, where it's not tied to a commodity, there has been a lot of concern about inflation, and many countries have inflation targeting regimes. So there is a sense in which money isn't limitless. There's an understanding that if the amount of money just grows without bound, it will just lead to inflation. So I don't think that decision is central to the moral quality of money. Let me tell you what we teach at university. What we teach at university is true, but I think it's limited. Going to the definition of money, we define it as a means of exchange. It's a replacement for barter. We call it a store of value. That just means it's a way of carrying wealth through time, and it's a unit of account. It's a measuring stick for all goods and services. Now that's true, but I would like to argue that money is two more things. It's a means of generosity, and generosity is not the same thing as exchange. And so if you go to a Christmas function and people give each other gifts, if they've got a bad relationship, yes, that can be an exchange. But if they've got a good relationship, that means so much more. And another thing that I think we need to do is recapture the idea of a dangerous love of money, which is a pre-modern idea, but I think it's actually right.
But is the opposite of the ideological foundations of our economy. I mean, the whole idea that we built this on is people pursuing their own ends and competing will ultimately serve the greater good, so that the social cause, the social good, is served by people more or less forgetting about that. And I think that is now a mythology that's coming under sustained attack, which gets us to Scott's point. I'm interested in your thoughts on this. Is this something you can handle through regulation? Or does it require some kind of more thoroughgoing moral reckoning in order for this to be rectified?
I think it requires both. I don't think we can expect perfection, but we can and should expect the trustworthiness we usually find in, say, teachers and doctors. The moral reckoning about the love of money, I think, should be there. There's an old-fashioned quote which you don't hear much in this neoliberal age anymore, that money is the root of all evil, as though the mere use of money implies evil. Maybe Aristotle would have thought that, I don't know. But I prefer the original, the correct quote from the Bible is that the love of money is the root of all kinds of evil. So I wouldn't say that the money itself is the cause of evil, but being captivated by money and financial motivation. And there's actually a lot of emerging psychological evidence that money can captivate us in very surprising ways.
And I think that is really much, much closer to the Aristotelian notion. It's not that money as such, dirtying oneself with coinage or currency, is somehow something that's corrupting. But it's once, I mean, if you recall that for Aristotle, the vision of the moral life is a life within limits. And those limits are initially external, so it's the relationships we have one with another, and it's the forms of habit and habituated virtue in which we train and cultivate and instruct ourselves. But then that those external limits then become internal limits, where one reaches the point where, for instance, you refuse to profit at the expense of the immiseration of another. And I think that's where the love of money, the idea that one can accumulate with impunity, and because that accumulation is insubstantial, it's not like I'm just hoarding cars or hoarding potatoes or whatever, but because I'm simply hoarding digits, then that is somehow a costless crime. Whereas, both for Aristotle and within the larger Christian tradition, the first victim of the crime of hoarding is actually the person who's doing the hoarding.
Yeah, what you're really talking about is something much broader than money, I think, and that is the virtue of limits generally.
Yes.
And you could then apply that to all kinds of things. So the environment, not least of which, the idea that not all things are made for us to conquer, for example. There's a whole ethic there that seems very alien to the way that we talk about things now, that seems, I don't know, renewed in its urgency or its relevance. That's it, though, for the radio show. We don't have any more time, but Gordon, please do hang around for the podcast where we'll really get stuck in. If you subscribe, you're about to hear some more goodies. That's Gordon Menzies, who was our guest for this week. See you next.
Hi, Natasha.
Yeah, well, I thought that was pretty interesting. One thing I take issue with, Waleed Ali suggested that the prohibition on usury was a Muslim thing. And it's true. Muhammad did say in about the year 600 AD, He said that Allah forbids usury, because usury means charging interest on a loan. And what Muhammad said was that he came at the end of a long line of prophets, or he came after a long line of prophets. Currently that's being interpreted by most of the Muslim world as being at the end of, but let's just say after a long line of prophets. And in order to be a good upstanding Muslim, you have to obey the teachings of the previous prophets who's prepared the ground for Muhammad's arrival and ministry. So that means you have to pay attention to everything that Jesus said, plus everything John the Baptist said, plus everything Moses said, plus everything Deuteronomy said, because they're the ones that Muhammad mentioned. And Jesus threw the money lenders out of the temple because they were charging interest on loans. They were usurers. Back in the days when there was a temple of Solomon, the theory was that you could make an animal sacrifice to the God of the Jews. So people were buying animals out the front of the temple, and in the courtyard of the temple, inside the temple, there were money lenders who were lending people the money to buy the animals to kill in the temple, and usury is forbidden. So therefore the entire sacrifice, the blood sacrifice at the Temple of Solomon, was being turned blasphemous by the usurious nature of the funding for the animal that was going to have its throat cut. So Jesus overturned the tables and threw the money lenders out of the temple. The reason that he did that was because Jesus was a Jew, and the Jews pay attention to the Old Testament or the Torah, and in Genesis, Deuteronomy says that usury is forbidden. So they did mention that there's no prohibition against capital. There is no prohibition against being rich. If you postulate a world where people who've been fortunate, people who've worked hard, people who've accumulated a surplus are at perfect liberty to lend that surplus to somebody else, but they'll only get back what they gave out. So if the economy booms and grows and there's a period of inflation, they'll get back less than the purchasing power of what they lent out, but they can't charge any interest because interest is blasphemy and God forbid it, right? Then instead of lending money on stupid projects that are a bad idea in the long run but will prove to be highly profitable in the short term, which is the situation at the moment, people who've accumulated a surplus of anything, whether it's wheat or cattle or sawn timber or whatever it is that generates their medium of exchange and gives them a surplus, they're only going to lend money for things that they think are a good idea. If they know a couple that are horribly badly matched and the marriage won't last for longer than a couple of years, they probably won't lend money to them for buying a house. If they know a couple that's really well matched, they'll probably lend them some money to build themselves somewhere to live. If somebody comes along and says, oh, I want to borrow the money to buy the land so I can fell it and then I can sell all the timber and then I can flog the shit out of it as a cultivation paddock, and then when all the soil's gone I can subdivide it and sell it to yuppies looking for a tree change. No, if you can't charge interest on loans, then nobody's going to lend a person the money to do something as stupid as that. So I can see where they're going. They've got a few details wrong, but yeah, essentially there's nothing actually wrong with working your ass off and getting rich. What's wrong is the idea of trying to use that money to make more money by lending it out to people and charging them interest, so that you lend them $6,000 to buy a car and expect them to pay back $13,000 over 5 or 6 years, while the car is eventually worth nothing by the time they finish paying the loan off and owning it. Same with houses, take out a 25-year mortgage on a house that's got a design life, well, half life to failure of 10 to 12 years. So by the time you own it, it's falling to pieces. But yeah, that was a very interesting coverage of the Australian Royal Commission into the banking industry. And it's interesting that the bloke who resigned from AMP this week, he was Malcolm Turnbull's financial advisor to the Prime Ministership. So that might explain something about why it's taken so long to get the Royal Commission up and happening and running. And yeah, clearly the Australian financial industry is in a mess. and we're headed into a drought, and there's no water in the river because the entire Murray-Darling Basin Commission plan was a mistake from the start, and the mistake has been rorted 3 separate ways since then. Life's like that. Things is crook in Tullarook, and we'll all be ruined, said Hanrahan. So warbles on a lot to YouTube. Ciao.